Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of today's lecture is the Apollonian and the Dionysian and the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Well, at first I must admit it's really difficult to interpret such an extraordinary phenomenon as Friedrich Nietzsche. He's undoubtedly one of the most controversial figures in the development of Western thought, but at the same time quite a symbolic one. It's sufficient to say that in the Third Reich he was considered to be the national philosopher. He was adored by the Führer and the top-ranking bosses of the regime. He was considered to be the source of inspiration for the German people in many ways. His works were extremely popular at that time, and not without a certain reason. But in order to understand the specificity of his thought, we have to cast a glance at the circumstances within which his mind was formed and his major insights were formulated. Here I have to say that perhaps this is one of the greatest problems in dealing with such an extraordinary figure, because he did not construct a system in philosophy. His philosophy is a strange, somewhat weird combination of myths and insights and ideas, well, which are erratic very often, and it's extremely difficult to arrange them into something coherent. Plus, of course, we have to keep in mind the fact that the last 10 years of his life he spent in a madhouse, and his madness had, well, quite an extraordinary influence on his later works, but we also have to say that the traces of his madness could be found in his earlier writings, say one of the major works written at the first stage of his creative activities, the book that's called The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. Well, in order to understand him, as far as that understanding can be achieved, well, we have to keep in mind the fact that the irrational in the Western European philosophy of the modern time was gaining momentum. It was becoming more and more popular, and it was in stark contrast to the predominance of the irrational, which was typical of the intellectual situation in Western European countries in the late 18th century in the first place. Well, the causes for the onslaught of the irrational, not only in Western European philosophy in modernity, but also in arts in general, well, the cause of that seems to be quite clear. Well, it's this strange combination of the social, economic and political upheavals in Europe in the aftermath of the Great French Revolution on the one hand, the Napoleon Wars on the other, and the general atmosphere of depression and dissatisfaction with rationality at large. Well, it is in the 19th century that in Western European countries, particularly among intellectuals, in intellectual circles, that this steady decline in the popularity of rationalism in all its forms and manifestations became particularly conspicuous, while the traces of that decline can be found in arts in the first place. But the development of sciences and the obvious achievements in the field of sciences at that time had laid the ground for the unprecedented amount of optimism among Western intellectuals in the possibility of transforming social reality with the help of the achievements of sciences. And a lot of optimism of that sort was supported by many. That was the period of time when enthusiasm about the development of sciences and progress at large was at its peak. But in the course of time it was becoming more and more clear that sciences and progress could not guarantee the transformation of human nature, its change for the better, could not provide the human race with the instruments and means of eradicating the evils of social nature and now transforming social reality or constructing the model of society which would be much better than everything mankind had experienced in the past. Well, sciences provided the human race with a lot of advantages, of course, but at the same time it was Mary Shelley, one of the prominent British authors of the early 19th century, who was the first to point at the fact that the development of sciences could also bring about the catastrophic consequences for the very survival of mankind. In her famous novel that was published in the early 19th century, the novel that's called Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, also pointed to the fact that well, any intrusion into human nature with the help of sciences, any attempt to transform it somehow in order to meet the requirements of the utopian approach to reality, or the utopian dreams, which had been rather popular in the time of the Renaissance. As we very well know, any intrusion into human nature may be catastrophic indeed. And that sounded as a warning. Well, that sort of warning turned out to be very important in the circumstances when the lack of belief in the irrational and meaningful nature of human history and the development of mankind on the whole was becoming more and more widespread, was really spreading thick and fast, particularly among poets, artists of all sorts, and men of letters. But let me remind you about the extraordinary influence of that sort of pessimism that was gradually replacing the optimistic expectations about human future and the future of the human race on the whole. Let me remind you about the pessimistic feelings which were becoming stronger and stronger, as I have already said, particularly among men of letters. Well, say in France, the poetry of the so-called French symbolism was permeated with the depressive expectations, and the dark side of being was in the focus of the attention of men of letters, not only in France but also in the rest of Europe at that time, which was quite symptomatic to my mind. Say Charles Baudelaire was under the great influence of that ever-growing interest in the dark side of being, and one of his most remarkable poems is called Litanie de Satan. I will try to quote a couple of lines from that verse in French. Well, I beg your pardon for my accent, of course, but it's really important to my mind, well, because indeed I have to reiterate it again. And well, it sounds like a sort of a diagnosis of the intellectual and spiritual in Europe at that time, the very important feature of the spiritual atmosphere. So the verse says, Ôte pas le plus bon et le plus savant des anges, Dieu trahi par le sort et privé de louange, patron des exilés, l'âme des inventeurs, confesseur des pendus et de conspirateurs, père abortif de ceux qui, sans noire colère du paradis terrestre, a chassé Dieu le Père. Ô Satan, prends pitié de ma longue misère. Well, the final line of this verse says, Satan, take pity on my misery. Well, that sounds quite extraordinary to my mind, because on the wave of atheism and materialism, which were one of the most important features of the spiritual atmosphere of modernity, in the 19th century, the interest in the dark, the interest in the satanic was on the steady rise, and it's also something that can be qualified as a sign of the ever-growing depression, the lack of interest in the positive aspects of being, the lack of faith that being at large, reality at large, is something that can be open to human cognition, is something that can be interpreted as a system and a hierarchy of values and essences, is something that makes sense. Well, that loss of faith in the meaningfulness of being, well, goes parallel to the ever-growing nihilistic trend in the intellectual climate of Europe. And those two tendencies can be found in, their manifestations can be found in abundance in Nietzsche's writings, both at the earlier and later periods of his creative activities. To my mind, one of the most important things of which I have just said is the lack of belief that human history makes sense. Human history and being were interpreted in many cases like something really irrational and absurd. And the popularity of the irrational in philosophy was also on the steady rise at that time. Most Western intellectuals believed that reality cannot be grasped in a traditional way, in traditional philosophical concepts or notions. Reality lies well beyond human cognition because it's chaotic, it's sporadic, it's lacking not only sense but also paramount goals, or the ultimate goal of existence. Well, and it goes, of course, on the wave of the ever-growing atheistic and materialistic interpretations of reality. Metaphysics was brushed off as something nonsensical and obsolete, something outdated. The loss of popularity of metaphysics in the 19th century was really unprecedented. That was the breaking away from the mainstream Western philosophy of the earlier times. Of course, we can't say that the irrational in the 19th century is something really new or unprecedented. If we take a closer look at the spiritual atmosphere of the time, we will see that the irrational in the Western thought of the 19th century can be traced back to some of Plato's speculations, the late Stoicism of the Roman times, and of course the medieval philosophy of Western Europe that was full of mysticism and depression. Well, but at the same time, the type of the irrational that became predominant in Western thought in the 19th century had a certain novelty and certain specificity. Of course, on the one hand, it is the very close association with arts and the penetration into the field of arts that is typical of the irrational of the time. But on the other hand, as I have already said, it is the great achievements of sciences that exerted a great deal of influence upon the formation of the major irrational philosophical works at that period. And plus, of course, the fact that the historical situation of the time, the objective circumstances within which the most prominent representatives of the irrational created their works and expressed their ideas and insights, is also something that should be taken into consideration. Well, Nietzsche there is quite an exemplar figure in many ways. Well, here we come to the necessity of giving ourselves a broad outline of the major insights of his philosophy, the major problems that were envisaged by him in the course of his creative activities. Well, of course, it is aesthetics in many ways, the origins of beauty and the sense of beauty. Of course, it's history of philosophy, because he is considered to be one of the greatest experts, particularly in the history of Greek philosophy. And his earlier works have a very strong influence of that interest, bear quite a remarkable presence of the Greek thought. But also, it is the criticism of Christianity that lies in the very foundation of his approach to the spiritual history of Western Europeans since the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and the onslaught of Christianity, and up to the present day time. Well, his criticism of Christianity and the system of Christian moral values was really unprecedented. It was shocking for his contemporaries. It remains to be shocking for people today, and very often he is condemned for that, but again, in the Third Reich, it was his criticism of Christianity that made him so extraordinarily popular with the Nazis. And, of course, his idea of the so-called his image of blonde beast, well, it's hardly a concept, it's hardly a notion, of course, it's more like a myth. But his speculations upon the future of mankind, his speculations upon what is in store for the human race, and his famous myth of transition from underhumans to superhumans, which is considered by him to be, you know, the real paramount goal in the existence of mankind since the beginning of history. Well, all of that constitutes the bulk of his philosophy, you know, something that makes him so very special in many ways. Plus, of course, we have to keep in mind the fact that he was quite an extraordinary writer. He was a very talented, a very skillful expert in classics and classical philology. He became a professor in classical philology in Switzerland, in Basel, at a very early age, if I'm not mistaken. It was when he was just, he was appointed professor in classical philology at Basel University when he was just 23 or something like that. And his major idea, which is will to power, well, he is quite adamant that every type of living matter is aspiring to predominance, while the striving for predominance is interpreted by him as part and parcel of the existence of every type of living matter, man in the first place. Well, he tries to explain everything that occurs in human life and human history through the prism of his idea of will to power. Well, some of the experts in the history of Western philosophy say that Nietzsche's will to power was not new, that at least partly it was well, inherited from Schopenhauer's concept of will, universal will, but we here are not in a position to debate things like that, because, well, I don't think it's really important whether he was quite original in formulating that myth of his, or well, borrowed some of the ideas of his predecessors. To me, the most important thing about his philosophy is an attempt, or rather a series of attempts, to grasp reality as it is, reality which is not perceived anymore as the Gestalt model of being, but rather as something which is constantly in flux, as something which is constantly changing, something which is very often chaotic, absurd, and meaningless, something that is based on blind chance, having no predestination and no God's interference whatsoever, for the very simple reason God is taught, or whatever is the phrase in German. God is dead, and that is one of the postulates of Nietzsche's philosophy. Well, he says that the world without the divine presence, the world without God, reality which is well beyond any religious interpretation or explanation, reality which is perceived through the prism of atheism and materialism, reality which is deprived of any ultimate goal or any divine assistance, is something that gives us a unique chance to speculate upon a place which a human being may hold in such a universe. Of course, at times it sounds quite pessimistic, but since there is no place for the divine in Nietzsche's vision of reality, it leads to posing a number of really important psychological and existentialist questions, which are quite significant for the very survival of a human being in the world, which is not based anymore upon the divine force, upon the divine support. Indeed, if there is no place for the divinity in reality, which is described in his philosophy, it means that an individual is expected to manifest the utmost extent of courage, existentialist courage, to survive, to fight against all the odds and absurdity of being, to hold his own place and improve it, most probably, in order to realize his ambitions. And the realization of those ambitions can be achieved only through the transformation of human nature on the way to the superhuman. That upgrading of human nature is considered by Nietzsche to be one of the major preconditions of the eventual success of the human race. Of course, it's not for most, perhaps it's not for all, it's for the minority of the humans to undergo that sort of transformation of human nature, hopeful to their success in the end. But the survival of the minor part of the human race is something that justifies the loss of many. Well, he sounds quite categorical in that way, and is condemned very often for his lack of humanism as far as the fight for the better future of the human race is concerned. But again, I have to say that he sounds rather harsh in many ways, and we are hardly in any position to condemn him right now for that. We have to keep in mind the fact that his specificity as a thinker, the originality of his philosophy, was really extraordinary in his time, let alone ours. So we have to accept him as he was, without any attempts on our part to check him, to correct him anyhow, or to improve his interpretation of human culture and history through the artificial and ill-grounded Christianization of his thought, which sometimes occurs in the works of those experts in history of philosophy who speculate upon his philosophical legacy. So he should be treated as he was, without any corrections. Another thing which is very important, if we are to get back to his interest in ancient Greece and Greek culture, is something that I would like to dwell upon in detail today, which is the interpretation of the major components of which Greek culture of the classical epoch consisted. He says in his major earlier work, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, that if we are to understand ancient Greece correctly, we have to keep in mind the fact that the Greek civilization and Greek culture were based upon two major aspects, or two major elements, which are denoted in his work as the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Here I have to say a few words about Apollo and Dionysus. Of course, those two prominent gods of the Olympic pantheon represent the two extremes in many ways. Apollo is considered to be the god of light, the sun, the rational. He manifests form and formality at large, the sense of measure that permeates reality on all its levels, while the golden mean, which is considered to be the major criterion of a proper moral act, say in the philosophy of Aristotle, and of course the so-called principium individuationis, the principle of individuality, without which no physical object, no artifact of culture can exist. So the Apollonian, if we are to sum up all those characteristics of the Olympic god, is something that constitutes the so-called Gestalt model of being as a system, a structure, a hierarchy, something which is arranged and organized according to the principle of ever-growing sophistication, if I'm allowed to put it this way. We're moving upward from the lower structures of being, making it more and more complex on every level of existence. Plus, of course, this is the irrational model of being, which means that it's open to human cognition and may be expressed in terms of notions, ideas, and concepts. At the same time, we have to say that Nietzsche's approach to Apollo is somewhat different from what we can find in the classical philosophical tradition of ancient Greece, of which I have just said, because he says that Apollo comes to a human being in dreams. So in his work, Apollo, the Apollonian, is very closely associated with dreaming, and this is something that makes me believe that here we come to gain a better understanding of the initial impulse that makes it possible for a creative mind to express his or her creativity in forms. So if inspiration comes to a human being in dreams, it means that dream may be interpreted as a sort of a source, of that inspiration, some sort of a channel through which the divine, whatever is understood, in that manifests itself or speaks to a human being. Of course, keeping in mind the fact that atheism was quite a popular trend in the 19th century, perhaps the very use of the term divine here is purely conditional. Nature itself, perhaps, is speaking to a creative mind in dreams, and that would be the more correct interpretation of Nietzsche's idea. Here comes the time to say a few words about Dionysus. Dionysus is the symbol of the dark, chaotic, the irrational, wild, irregular. He is the symbol of agitation and excitement. He is subject to fits of madness, and he is the source of those fits. Human beings who serve him experience from time to time. His priests and priestesses, very well known to have experienced those feats, particularly in a state of drunkenness. And Dionysus symbolizes the lack of order, the lack of law. Well, since being is lacking law and order, any meaning or purpose, the most correct way of interpreting it would be to consider it purely chaotic, and Dionysus, with his irregular forces of most wild and most primitive nature, with his joyfulness, his fits of merriment which are not curbed by any civilized regulations or limitations, is of course the most appropriate symbol of everything that might be associated with the irrational approach to being. And the choice of that god on Nietzsche's part does not seem to be strange or inexplicable. For him, the Dionysian complex is the complete dissolution of an ego through the unity with wild nature that is reached in a state of madness or drunkenness. Alcoholic drinks, which were widely used in Dionysian rites, produced that state of drunkenness in which an individual would lose his ego complex, would forget about himself for a while, and plunge into the abyss of the most wild and irregular unity with Mother Nature as it is. What is really important here is to say that inspiration of an artist that comes in dreams through Apollo here comes in a state of drunkenness. Dionysus is in charge of that, so he gives an artist, his own impulses, his own stimuli that would make it possible for him to express his creativity in that wild and irregular way. And it seems to be really significant if we are to understand the origins of aesthetics at large. So here we have the combination of two major sources of inspiration for an artist. The combination which is consisting of the two oppositions. The one is the Apollonian and the other one is the Dionysian. Well, the combination is very changeable, of course. It's in constant flux, and the proportions of the Apollonian and the Dionysian as the major sources of inspiration may also be quite different. But you know, as far as the balance between Apollo and Dionysus was being kept up in ancient Greek culture, well, the culture of the Greeks produced really remarkable masterpieces. Apollo is responsible for plastic arts, sculpture and architecture in the first place, and Dionysus is responsible for music. Well, the combination of those two major aspects of Greek culture, from Nietzsche's point of view, laid the grounds for the triumph of ancient Greece, or the classical era, and at the earlier stages of its development. But the very fact that the balance between Apollo and Dionysus was eventually struck in favor of the former, from his point of view, entailed a number of catastrophic consequences for the Greeks. Well, their culture after Socrates was growing more and more formal and rational. Well, the predominance of the formal and rational in the Greek culture of the later periods of its development was definitely harmful and did a lot of damage to the integrity of the Greek civilization on the whole, weakened it up to a very large extent, and laid the grounds for the eventual domination of the new type of religiosity and culture that came around into the Greco-Roman world, with the spreading of Christian communities and eventually the organization of Christian churches throughout the Roman Empire, first in the eastern provinces of Rome and later in the west. From Nietzsche's standpoint, that was indeed detrimental. But as long as the balance between Apollo and Dionysus is preserved, the culture of Greeks was all right, and it sounds like a promise for the later Europeans, for European culture of the later times, because the balance can be restored, and the harmony between the Apollonian and the Dionysian can be regained in the end, which may be considered as a promise of a better future and possibly the survival of European culture in its authenticity at the later stages of its development. And here comes another problem which is of great interest to me. So if dreams and drunkenness are considered to be the major sources of inspiration for an artist, how can we interpret the very phenomenon of creativity? What is creation, and why is it so important for the development of any type of culture? Well, to my mind, if we are to find a common denominator between dreams and drunkenness, we are to keep in mind the fact that in both of those states of mind, an individual loses his ego complex. He forgets about his individuality, he forgets about his own very self. So that state of forgetfulness that is typical of both dreams and state of drunkenness is something that brings us closer to the proper understanding of the very act of creating something new. Because when an individual is involved in the act of creating something new, well, as long as the process is going on, he tends to forget about his own very self. And perhaps it is that very consigning of the ego complex to oblivion which seems to be typical of any act of creating something new, is something that makes creation of all sorts so very attractive to human beings. It's not also something that makes them equal to God, that makes them on a par with him. But fundamentally, it's something that helps them overcome the phobias, the fear of death in the first place, because as long as we are forgetful of our own ego complex, our own very self, we forget about our mortality as well. And it helps us overcome that really deeply rooted fundamental fear, something that makes us feel almost immortal, if not divine, if an act of creativity is accomplished properly and results in something that was expected by an artist himself in the first place. So when we take a look at the greatest artists in the history of European culture since the times of ancient Greece up to the present day time, when we ask ourselves why they were so infatuated with their creations, with the very act of creating something new, intoxicated by the process of making something that did not exist before, why very often they sacrificed their lives, like it was the case with Michelangelo, for example, for the sake of creating something new and manifesting his talents in different fields, in practically all the arts, from poetry to sculpture and architecture. Well, the answer appears to be quite obvious as on the surface, because it's indeed some sort of drug addiction. When involved in the process of creating something new, an individual loses his knowledge of his own mortality. He goes beyond any limitations and restrictions of being as a structure based upon a certain number of laws, and the laws which can be open to human cognition, the laws that do not promise anything in terms of immortality for a human being. It's indeed something that makes an individual feel really divine and feel really equal to God himself, because through the creation of something principally new, something that did not exist before, you may feel like a God. And the intoxication of that feeling may be really so strong that an individual feels really attracted to the very act of creating, and comes back to it time and again, while sometimes forgetting not only about his own life and the time he spends on what he is making with his own hands, but also about life at large, about being at large, because the creation of a principally new reality is making you its master, its lord. And it's again something that boosts the popularity of creative activities of all sorts quite a lot. It's something that stimulates most powerfully an individual's interest in doing things like that. So here we have the combination of both philosophical, ontological, and existentialist factors that make creation the unique manifestation of human nature, something through which an individual, a human being, aspires to the divine, aspires to the superhuman, and very often reaches the goal. It's not only the realization of ambitions, it's also some sort of addiction, which is perhaps the strongest one among all sorts of addictions. And indeed, it's something that can be brought down to the common denominator, if we are to get back for a second to Apollo and Dionysus. In the act of creating a new world, in the act of creating a new reality, be it a simple artifact of culture or something grander, something on a larger scale, an individual forgets about his ego complex, about his mortality. His nature is transformed, at least for the time being, and it's not that very important whether it comes around through dreams or through the state of drunkenness of which Nietzsche said when he was speculating upon the nature of the Dionysian. What is really important is the fact that time and again when an individual turns to creating something new, time and again when he tries to use both the Apollonian and the Dionysian to the best of his abilities, he acquires that state of superhuman that makes him a god. god, at least in his own eyes, if not in the eyes of the generations to come. So that is as simple as that. So here I have to finish up.